If you follow Jay's analysis, or if you've read my books, then you're familiar with Eyes Wide Shut and the work of Stanley Kubrick. However, you may not be familiar with a lesser-known film that is actually Eyes Wide Shut before the time. This is the film Eye of the Devil. We're going to take a look at Eye of the Devil, its symbolism, and how Hollywood was telling us what really goes on long before Kubrick did Eyes Wide Shut. Eye of the Devil is a 1966 mystery horror film filled with occult and supernatural themes, as we'll see, directed by J. Lee Thompson. It stars Deborah Kerr, David Niven, and Sharon Tate. The film is set in rural France at the Chateau de Hautfort. It is also set in England. Eye of the Devil is based on the novel Day of the Arrow by Robin Estridge. It's going to be filled with a lot of esoteric imagery, so let's start one by one. Before we look at that, it's important to point out the circles that Roman Polanski was chilling with. If you look at Art News, there's a fascinating article about Kenneth Anger, the revolutionary Luciferian filmmaker who promoted Crowley in a lot of his works. Now, the reason I pointed this out was that not just the overt Luciferian imagery and themes in these films that he put together, sort of short films, but to point out that Anger was also connected to Alfred Kinsey. We're told that Anger pleasured himself for Alfred Kinsey's sex studies. This tipped off the Rolling Stones to Joys of the Devil, which published a scabrous Tinseltown tell-all, Hollywood Babylon, which you've heard me talk about. He also helped Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard shift from writing to rewriting the rules of cinema. He also was connected to the Hells Angels riots at Altamont, and he lived with Bobby Boss O'Leil, who would be the man involved in the Manson murders. And that, of course, is how he's connected to Sharon Tate. This goes on to mention that Scorpio rising, Lucifer rising, suggested loose interpretations of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then it mentions his living with Bobby Boss-O'Leil, part of the Manson gang. So I just wanted to point out that the deaths of Sharon Tate, Frykowski, and Folger, immediately also connected to Jay Sebring, are in the circles of Roman Polanski. It's all in the same group of people. And this shows us the occult and esoteric and dark side of Hollywood even back then. Now you might say, so what? We all know this now. But what's interesting is that people then didn't know. They weren't aware of this, right? Maybe after the Manson murders, people started questioning it. But what I'm getting at is that this movie, Eye of the Devil, the Eyes Wide Shut before its time, it actually shows the decadence, depravity, and darkness of the elite. The film begins with a series of images that show us kind of foreshadowings of what's to come in the film. We see a dead bird, arrows being shot, and particularly the bird here signifies the foreshadowing of the sacrifice that is to come. Now, the film centers on the narrative of a wealthy family in England, and the father, the head of the household, is going to have to make a sudden trip back to his rural French estate. We don't know exactly why at the beginning, but we do get the impression that they are lavishly wealthy and they have at least some notion of nobility or maybe even some Merovingian elite bloodline. They are part of the Frankish elite. Now, as he goes back, he discovers that the vineyards are failing and the wife and the kids, they want to come along. Initially, he tells them no, but they decide they're going to do it anyway. Now, we see that the Sharon Tate character here is shown with a sacrificed bird, and you'll see the arrow there. The arrows figure into this prominently, and we'll see why here in a moment. But initially, when he goes back to his estate, and then eventually his wife comes as well, the wife stumbles into this strange ritual going on in the castle's Catholic chapel. She's confused, she's bumfuddled, and she can't figure out what this Illuminati ritual is that's going on in her husband's chapel. So she begins to ask a lot of questions, and she gets a lot of deflection. However, as you can see, the dedication of the dead bird here is a foreshadowing of the fact that there's going to be another true sacrifice to come. And this is kind of the initial offering before the final sacrifice. Tate's character, not surprisingly, turns out to be a witch, and she just kind of hovers around, lingers and loiters around the estate property in a very obscure, psychopathic way. She says that she's not into men except her brother, hinting that there is something incestuous going on. Her brother is, of course, a evil, demonic-looking Legolas who also plays with the minds of the children. They both essentially lead the children down a dark path, ultimately with the intention of initiating them. As you see here, the child holds her necklace, and it is the necklace that is the, quote, eye of the devil here. So it's a sort of dark, magical pendant that permeates the film. Now, we don't know exactly what's going on, but we know that there's something dark and mysterious happening. We know that there's a family secret that has not been revealed, and it's essentially the wife, who is the protagonist of the film, who's trying to figure out what her husband's deep, dark secret is. So she sort of stumbles around the estate for several minutes of the film. She investigates the vast archives and library of the estate and cannot figure out what's going on, except that in the history of the family, there have been notorious untimely deaths, multiple untimely deaths. So we're beginning to think that this might have to do with human sacrifice. Now, not only that, there's a lot more going on in this film. For example, we might think, okay, well, it's just a cult that sacrifices people. Well, I want to point out that when the children are playing at the beginning, there's an interesting line where, and there's a brother and a sister. Here, it's mainly the brother, since he's the firstborn, that takes the most significance in the film. The brother and the sister are playing, and the sister says, "I'm Marie Antoinette, and you represent the spirit of French freedom." Now, this is fascinating because the modern world and its revolutions don't accidentally come out of France. It makes perfect sense why revolutions have come out of France, and that's because there's long been a tradition in France, going back to the medieval Gnostics and the Cathars, of Luciferian and Gnostic initiation and worship. That's in fact what this film is about, and most people have missed that. And not only that, I'm going to show you that the film reveals that this secret satanic cult was actually working under the guise of being Roman Catholic. Spoiler alert, it's a Frankish, Luciferian, Cathar, satanic pagan cult. When we see the father praying in the chapel, initially we think that he's bowing down before perhaps the crucifix that you see in the foreground. However, as the film later reveals, he's not bowing before the crucifix. He's in fact bowing at the center of the 8-pointed star, the star of Inanna or Ishtar. This again suggests the return of nature worship, or a secret underground cult that worships Gnostic pagan principles of nature. Generally speaking, nature worship, oddly enough, always asks for some kind of human sacrifice, right? And in this case, just like Wicker Man, we're told that a human sacrifice is necessary to ensure the restoration of his vineyards. His vineyards crop this year have been extremely bad. They've been dead the entire year. And so in order to save the crop, he believes that his firstborn is going to have to die. And then we later learned that this was a long-standing, millennium-long family tradition. In fact, the wife goes back into the archives of the family and discovers that for the last 1,000 years back to the Crusades, this prominent, elite, Frankish, Luciferian bloodline has been offering up their firstborn sons. So we start to see that this film is telling us about the bloodlines of the elite, the bloodlines of the Illuminati. And yes, it is real. And yes, they resent all outsiders. This is another fascinating fact to the film, is that the wife is continually treated as a profane outsider to the cult. Even her husband, who claims to love her very much, he places her behind the members of the cult. We even see the Sharon Tate character enjoying being whipped and beat because she put the mother in a trance. She uses basically hypnosis techniques and drug techniques. She gives belladonna to the wife, and yet she enjoys it. So there's this bizarre sort of enjoyment of bondage and sadomasochism. This immediately makes us think not only of this, but other stories very similar in terms of like the Rothschild balls and parties that we've seen. You've probably seen those images, but I'll show you again. The notion of the masked ball has been covered many times, but these are actual photos from vintage Rothschild parties based around surrealism and obviously containing the themes of mind control. There's even Audrey Hepburn shown with her head inside of a bird cage. This, again, I think shows us that the decadent views of the elite, the decadent worldview of the elite, they're not accidental. They actually have a consistent pattern to them. And so what we're looking at in this French castle here is essentially the black nobility of Europe. Right? These are in many ways, the bloodlines of the European elite. Now, the bad news, as we said, is that there is a human sacrifice going on here. And if we look at the history of the Merovingian mythos, this is somewhat similar to what we get in other films. If we think about the Merovingian in The Matrix, in part 2 of The Matrix, the Merovingian is pictured as a vampiric character who essentially sucks the blood or life force out of the beings around him. His 2 minions are, in fact, vampires. These wealthy Frankish elites were, in essence, partly responsible for the destruction of Byzantium. If you look at the history of the rise of the Frankish rulers, I don't think it's accidental that the film is showing us this continuation of decadence from the time of the French elite all the way up through to the present day. Even though this is fiction, I think, again, Polanski was in these same circles. It's not accidental that Roman Polanski makes films like The Ninth Gate that came out the exact same year as Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut that have the exact same themes as Eyes Wide Shut. But it's not just this film or Rosemary's Baby or other Polanski's film. There's a lesser known Polanski film that has a similar theme that I also want to touch on. The Fearless Vampire Killers is another film that stars Polanski's Sharon Tate, his one-time wife. And although this is a horror comedy, what's fascinating about The Fearless Vampire Killers is that in the midst of the narrative, the dialogue of the film, all the vampires at one point mandate that they must worship and serve Lucifer. They, in fact, declare their allegiance to Lucifer, and they inhabit an elite castle. Now, Polanski is, of course, making a comedy here, but again, I don't think this pattern, this theme, is accidental. We learn in the film, believe it, believe it, believe it, or leave here, refers to the mind control that Philippe, the father of the household, underwent. In fact, Philippe, who was under the tutelage of the Donald Unpleasant character, who is the fake priest, the Luciferian priest pretending to be a Roman Catholic priest, he was raised by, under the tutelage of Donald Pleasance. So the Philippe character, who at one time thought he might escape, was actually put into some kind of hypnotic state because he regresses to this point. He's triggered by his wife at one time to say, where she says, leave this cult, let's leave it. His response is, believe it, believe it, believe it, or leave it. And so he goes into a trance and he breaks his glass. So we see that this cult, just like the Sharon Tate character has done with the wife, she puts the wife in a trance and uses hypnosis. And they use drugs, they use belladonna. He's been put under the same spell. And it's hinted at, they can't really come out and say it, but given the fact that he practices BDSM, and given the fact that she says she's not into men, only her brother, we can infer that this is an inbred elite, essentially sex magic cult as well. There's an important line too where Sharon Tate says that she was trained to be this way, and she doesn't like other men because they're not like her brother. Other men have desires and concerns. They're not psychopathic and emotionless and feelingless. She's only interested in her fellow illuminists. And belladonna, we have to point out, is an extremely potent hallucinogen. It creates extreme trance and altered states and is very dangerous. It can even result in death. The trip is very long, 15 hours to 2 days, depending upon how long it's used. So we have to keep in mind that this is a Luciferian sex cult practicing pharmakia, or drug initiation and ritual, mind control, altered states, abuse of children, sex cult, magic, and then finally human sacrifice. We learn that there's an astrological element to the cult. That's the point of the Sagittarius, as we'll see. And it's time, it is coming time for the human sacrifice to be offered. Throughout the film, her brother, who is the archer, who is the one who actually performs the sacrifice, we see him constantly shooting things with arrows, constantly killing birds and so forth. And this is because he is the dealer of death. And in astrology, the archer is Sagittarius. This is why the group forms a circle. They represent times and seasons in astrology. And this is why in their crazy concocted pagan calendar, they've decided that now is the time for the human sacrifice. And they genuinely believe that it will be for the purpose of restoring their crops. Now, this is exactly the same plot as Wicker Man, which is interesting because it's another elite caste of European pagans who feel like they have to offer human sacrifice back to the spirits of nature in order to receive back from them. Now, this is everywhere in these elite occult religions. They're all based around nature worship and the forces immanent within nature. Those forces immanent within nature, however, do not turn out to be just natural forces, but in fact are conceived of as spirits that can be manipulated and invoked through ritual magic ceremonies and the resurrection of so-called pagan rites. While I'm on the theme of mind control, though, I should also mention that one of the few films that Sharon Tate did, besides the ones we mentioned, is Valley of the Dolls. Now, Valley of the Dolls has a curious plot because it's about girls trying to be famous in Hollywood, trying to make their name, and then eventually getting hooked on barbiturates, right? So they become basically dolls. They become mind-controlled slaves. And this is really a theme that runs through all of the mind control Illuminati narratives. We see this as a central plot theme for Mulholland Drive, for Lost Highway, and David Lynch's Inland Empire. And that's because this is a very real practice. So it's unfortunate that this happened to Sharon Tate, but the reason I bring it up is because her reality, her real life, matches up to the roles that she played. The roles she played in these films are essentially what she went through in real life. In fact, if you read her Wikipedia, it says it implies that she became a witch because she went and met with Alex Sanders, one of the famous proponents of witchcraft of the 20th century. And it's rumored, I'm not sure that it's verified, but it's rumored that she got into witchcraft through those means. One of the neat things about the film is that the estate has a giant painting of the robed men with the head of the household in the middle being sacrificed. So there's even a giant painting telling everybody what they do once a lifetime. So there's like predictive programming within the estate, within the movie, and nobody can figure it out. The wife eventually figures out that, oh yeah, plain as day, there's a giant painting on the wall, giant quilt basically, showing everybody what goes on. But she just couldn't come to believe it. So another interesting aspect of the film is that even though there's an abundance of evidence in front of everybody's eyes to see that this occult elite stuff is all true, people don't want to believe it. So it's not a lack of evidence or a lack of facts or a lack of data points. It's an unwillingness and a fear on the part of most human beings to admit that this stuff is real, because if it is, then it would suggest that maybe evil is real. And if evil is real, then probably good is real too, right? And that would suggest the existence of God. But the implications are a little too much for most people. But you'll notice there that the arrow shooting through there, the skull, is again one-eye imagery. One-eye imagery dominates this entire film. And in fact, again, her necklace is the all-seeing eye, and it is the eye of the devil. So I want to point out lastly the fact that the origins of this cult in the film coming out of France are not accidental. If we look at the history of the Cathars and the rise of the Cathari, perfected, the perfect, the elect, the chosen in medieval France, and their absurd, occultic, esoteric, and Gnostic views. They were in fact a secret society that were revolutionary and sought to institute a radical republic in the region that included all kinds of strange ideas and practices. I don't think it's far off to posit that the film was borrowing from the Cathari narrative, which is very real, and that the Cathari narrative, the secret society of the perfect, of the elect, that continued down through in the history of France, through the Frankish elite, to the time of the French Revolution, because the French Revolution was headed by people who were, in their own minds, Illuminati, or the perfecti, the perfect chosen elite. Now, what's fascinating about the Cathari, the Cathars, is the number of castles that they had. In fact, you'll notice this one here, Chateau de Pouvert, Chateau de Pervert. It actually looks like the chateau in the Ninth Gate. In fact, it could be. I wouldn't be surprised. The Ninth Gate is, of course, Polanski's film that I covered in my new book, Esoteric Hollywood 2, that is literally about Luciferian enlightenment. So as we read, and this is just from a history site on the Cathari castles, in the 12th century, a new religion took root in Europe known as Catharism. They were Gnostics, and they claimed that their beliefs were the true version of Christianity. And they came from the Byzantine Empire, supposedly, banished, and they came to the West. In the Byzantine Empire, they were known as the Bogomils. And they were a rival force to Catholicism. So they had not only one, but an entire buttload of castles. Look at all these. These are all Cathari castles. One of the most famous, of course, is Montségur. And I wonder if that's not in the background of the film. I think that it is. I think that the elite bloodlines, there is a real connection between these elite bloodlines and what we see in the film. I think it's kind of roughly based on that. And what really goes on in the real world. I mean, if you think about the Belgian elite, the story of Dutroux, the Dutroux affair, the occultic practices that went down at different castles in that story, that's really what's going on here. And I think that this overlooked film was telling us this long before Eyes Wide Shut or The Ninth Gate ever came out. Now, when it comes to the Cathari and the whole history of medieval heresies, I recommend the book Medieval Heresy by Malcolm Lambert. I read this back in my 20s, and it's extremely scholarly and very long book, but it's worth it because we see all of the weird connections and tie-ins between all these different groups. Now, you might think that, well, if the Cathari were a sect that believed in abstaining completely from marriage and that the only way to be saved was to be completely, supposedly, quote, perfect, then you might think that, well, they wouldn't have believed in occult or degenerate practices. But in fact, there's a very small, thin line between degenerate occult practices and these extreme doctrines of demons, as Paul calls them, to forbid marriage and so forth. And most of the time, if we go back to Irenaeus Against Heresies, in his voluminous treatment of the various Gnostic sects, we'll see the pattern that for most of the Gnostic sects, there might be an outer coterie of individuals who held to strict asceticism or some strict banning on eating foods or being married. And yet most of the time, the inner elite were completely degenerate. The inner elite practiced all kinds of degenerate sexual practices. And that's most likely what was going on here. I highly doubt that the inner coterie of the Cathari were really keeping all of these ascetical practices, but rather all things are permitted, right? That's another medieval sect that had the same dictum. That's what I think is going on here, and the film actually shows that. Now, the creepiest part of the film is Donald Pleasance, or Father Donald Unpleasant. We find out that he's actually the head of this satanic Luciferian human sacrifice cult. And it's not just this elite family, but the entire village has been converted over to this view. Now, if you read Lambert's book, you'll find that this was exactly what happened in France. Entire cities were converting to the Cathari heresies. And as a result, this threatened the entire state apparatus and social order. So we have to keep that in mind, because the real danger here is false Christianity, fake Christians, and cults within churches. If we think about Vatican II, if we think about the modern Roman Catholic Church, we've seen this exact same thing. We've seen a lot of abuse, we've seen a lot of scandals, and we've seen plenty of evidence that shows definitively that there were secret societies and occult groups that have infiltrated Rome, the Roman Church, and pose as Christians, but secretly they're not. That's exactly what this film is about. And I wonder if there wasn't a real revelation, a real message being told here that no one at the time could see. Who in the 1950s and 60s could have believed that the Roman Catholic Church was already suffering from these kinds of dangers? But in fact, even in the 60s, at the time of Vatican II, just this danger was being spoken of as the smoke of Satan entering the church. Long before Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, you see then, we were being told what was going on in the film Eye of the Devil. Eye of the Devil is much more than just a hokey occult movie from the 1960s. It's a window into the workings of the elite, of the esoteric and occult bloodlines. And yes, bloodlines of the Illuminati is a perfectly apt description for the film and its narrative and for the real world. Thank you for watching. If you like this analysis, be sure and subscribe below, press like and share, and click the bell for notifications. You can get my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Parts 1 and 2 at jaysanalysis.com.